The alarm buzzed at 4:30 in the morning with the kind of insistent electronic screech that made James Mitchell wish for just one moment that he could throw the cheap plastic clock across the room and watch it shatter against the wall. But he didn't because the alarm had cost him $8 at the dollar store 3 years ago, and replacing it would mean $8 that couldn't go towards Sophie's school supplies, or the propane bill that was due next week, or the slow leak in the truck's radiator that he'd been patching with sealant for the past 6 months. Instead, he reached across the worn nightstand with a calloused hand that bore the permanent stains of engine oil in the creases of his knuckles and shut off the noise before it could penetrate through the thin walls to wake the girl sleeping in the next room. For a moment, he lay still in the pre-dawn darkness, staring up at the water stain that spread across the ceiling like a forgotten shadow. Its edges mapped in his memory from 1,000 mornings of studying its contours, while his body tried to convince his mind that staying horizontal was the only reasonable response to exhaustion that had accumulated over 40 years of living and 5 years of single parenthood. His lower back ached with the dull persistence that had become his constant companion since the IED explosion outside Kandahar in 2006 had thrown him 12 feet through the air and introduced his spine to a concrete barrier at a velocity the Army doctors later told him should have paralyzed him or killed him, or at minimum left him unable to walk without assistance. That he could walk at all was, they'd said, with the careful optimism of medical professionals who'd seen too many outcomes go the other way, something approaching miraculous. That walking hurt like hell every single morning was something they'd also mentioned, though, with less enthusiasm and more resigned sympathy that suggested pain was simply the price of survival. James swung his legs over the edge of the bed with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned through bitter experience that sudden movements at 4:30 in the morning were an excellent way to spend the rest of the day, with his back locked in spasms that made breathing feel like a competitive sport. His bare feet found the cold wooden floorboards, the farmhouse's heating system being one of many mechanical systems that worked just well enough to avoid complete failure, but not well enough to provide actual comfort, and he stood slowly, vertebrae by vertebrae, until he'd achieved something approximating upright posture. 40 wasn't old, not really. Not by the standards of a world where people routinely lived into their 80s with the assistance of modern medicine and retirement accounts, and all the other infrastructure of comfortable aging that James had stopped believing in somewhere around the time his wife's cancer had turned their savings into medical debt, and then her funeral had turned that debt into something that would outlive him. But some mornings like this one, when the Oregon rain hammered against the windows with the fury of a storm front that the Weather Service had been warning about for 3 days, 40 felt like 60 or 70 or 100 felt like carrying the accumulated weight of every choice he'd made and every choice that had been made for him and every piece of bad luck that had fallen on his head like the rain was falling on the roof right now. He moved through the hallway with the practiced silence of a father who'd learned that waking a 12-year-old at 4:30 meant dealing with a grumpy child for the rest of the day, and also with the practiced silence of a former Army Ranger who'd spent enough time on night patrols that moving quietly had become as natural as breathing. Each creak of the floorboards was familiar, mapped in his muscle memory, the way the water stain was mapped in his visual memory. The house itself remembering every footfall of every generation that had lived here. Going back to his great-grandfather, who'd built the place in 1947 with lumber from trees, he'd felt himself an optimism about the future that the Korean War would shortly temper, but not entirely extinguish. The kitchen greeted him with the faint smell of yesterday's coffee grounds and the fainter smell of the mice that lived in the walls despite his best efforts with traps and poison, and the cat he'd briefly considered adopting, before realizing that feeding a cat was just another expense he couldn't justify. Not enough coffee beans left in the canister for a full pot, but he'd stretch what he had the way he stretched everything in these days: the peanut butter, the bread, the paycheck, from the mechanic shop, the tips from the cafe, the patience he tried to maintain. When Sophie asked him why they couldn't afford the things her classmates had, the hope that someday things would get better, even though 5 years of evidence suggested that better was a destination that kept receding faster than he could approach it. On the counter sat his wallet, and its leather so worn and cracked that it looked like something that had been left out in the desert sun for a decade, which wasn't far from the truth, given that he'd bought it at a PX in Afghanistan back when he'd been 22, and stupid enough to think that military service was going to set him up for a comfortable civilian life. Inside the wallet were three $20 bills at 10 and a handful of ones that added up to maybe $6 if he counted carefully. Also inside was his driver's license, which needed renewing next month and would cost him $85 he didn't have, and a photograph that had faded over 5 years of being carried and looked at and carried some more, but which had never lost its meaning no matter how much the colors had leached away. Lauren's smile, caught in time by a camera phone at the county fair the summer before her diagnosis, looked back at him with the kind of unguarded joy that people only showed when they didn't know that death was already growing inside them. She'd been 32 in that photograph, 8 years younger than James was now, and she'd been holding a caramel apple and laughing at something Sophie had said, and the evening light had caught her hair in a way that made her look like she was glowing from within. James brushed his thumb gently across the image, a ritual he performed every morning before starting his day, and whispered the words he always whispered, even though he knew she couldn't hear them, and even though he sometimes wondered if talking to photographs was the first sign of losing his grip on sanity. Morning, love, another day, still here, still fighting. He tucked the photograph back into the wallet with the care of a soldier tucking a keepsake into a breast pocket before heading into battle, which was more or less how he thought about his days now. Each one a small war against circumstances that wanted to grind him down, each one requiring strategy and endurance and the willingness to take hits without falling apart. The wallet went into his back pocket where it would stay all day, a constant reminder pressed against his body of what he'd lost and what he was fighting to preserve. Breakfast preparation was an exercise in making nothing look like something. The loaf of bread in the plastic bag on the counter had 2 slices left that were still soft enough to eat without toasting, though the edges were getting that dry, crumbly quality that meant he'd need to buy another loaf tomorrow, and that meant $3.49 from a budget that couldn't really spare $3.49, but also couldn't let his daughter go to school without lunch. He spread the peanut butter thinner than the label recommended, thin enough that he could see the white bread underneath, and told himself that protein was protein regardless of how much of it you got per serving. An apple carefully selected from the bowl that held 4 apples and would need to hold apples until the next grocery trip went into the brown paper lunch sack. The last granola bar from a box he'd bought on sale 2 weeks ago joined the apple. And then came his favorite part of the morning routine, the part that made all the rest of it worth enduring: the handwritten note on a paper napkin. Words scrawled quickly because he didn't have time for careful penmanship, but words chosen carefully because he had all the time in the world for making sure his daughter knew she was loved. Have a great day, kiddo. Your aerodynamics project is looking amazing. Those calculations about wing angles are smarter than anything I learned in engineering school. Keep reaching for the scarm. Love always, Dad. He folded the napkin with the same precision he brought to folding parachutes back when his life had depended on things being folded exactly right, and he slipped it into the lunch sack where Sophie would find it at noon when she was sitting in the cafeteria surrounded by kids who had lunch accounts and smartphones and parents who didn't have to choose between buying granola bars and fixing radiator leaks. This was how James stayed present even when he wasn't there, between the 12-hour days split between wrenching transmissions at Hank's Auto Repair and serving coffee at Rose's Diner, between the bills piling up on the counter and the exhaustion that made his bones feel like they were made of lead. He couldn't give Sophie everything he wanted to give her, or even everything she needed. But he could give her this. He could give her the certainty that every single day without fail her father was thinking about her and noticing what she was working on and believing in her even when the world seemed designed to make her feel small. He could give her words that said, "You matter, and you're brilliant, and I see you," in a world that mostly saw a poor kid from a falling down farmhouse on the edge of a dying town. And if that was all he could give her, then by God, he was going to give it perfectly. By the time the old pickup coughed to life in the driveway, the eastern sky was still dark and heavy with storm clouds that the weather forecasters had been warning about all week. November in Heartfelt, Oregon meant rain, and rain meant the county roads turned into rivers of mud, and mud meant his truck's bald tires would slip and slide and fight him for control every time he tried to brake or turn. The engine rattled like a tired friend who'd given too much for too long, but who kept showing up anyway because showing up was all either of them knew how to do, and James tightened his grip on the wheel and took a steadying breath before backing out onto the unpaved driveway that was already becoming a swamp. Out there in the shop and at the diner, he was just another man in a town full of men who were scrambling to make ends meet in an economy that had left small-town Oregon behind sometime in the 1990s and had never looked back. He was Jimmy to the guys at the garage and Mr. Mitchell to the customers who brought in their vehicles, and James to Rosa, who'd known him since he was Sophie's age, and who still remembered when his mother had worked the same counter he worked now. But here in this truck in the pre-dawn darkness, with the rain starting to fall and the radio playing country music at low volume, he was something more. He was a father, a widower, a veteran carrying pieces of metal in his back from an explosion that had killed two of his friends and wounded three others and left him with a purple heart he kept in a drawer, because looking at it made him think about the guys who hadn't come home and the families who'd gotten folded flags instead of their sons and brothers and husbands. He was a man who'd once been good at something, engineering problem solving, fixing things that were broken, but who'd had to set aside his degree and his dreams when medical bills and funeral costs had eaten his savings, and then eaten his credit, and then eaten any possibility of working in his field, because small-town Oregon didn't have aerospace companies or research facilities or any of the places that hired mechanical engineers. He was a man who measured his life in coffee grounds, stretched too thin, and peanut butter spread too sparse, and handwritten notes on napkins that cost a penny apiece. He was a man who loved his daughter more than his own life, and who would fight through any amount of pain or exhaustion or despair to make sure she had a chance at something better than what he had, even if better seemed like an impossible distance away. The drive to Hank's auto repair took 20 minutes on roads that were already slick with rain, past farms where families who'd been here for generations were slowly losing the fight against economics and weather and the general entropy that turned family businesses into foreclosure auctions. James knew most of these families had gone to school with their kids, had watched them struggle the same way he was struggling. There was a particular kind of solidarity in small-town poverty, a sense that you were all in the same leaking boat, and that the least you could do was help each other bail water, even when you knew the boat was sinking anyway. Hank's shop was a cinder block building with a corrugated metal roof that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt, and the sign out front still said, Hank's Auto Repair and Machine Shop. Even though the machine shop part had closed in 2008 when the recession had hit and nobody needed custom parts anymore. Hank himself was 67 and should have retired a decade ago, but his retirement account had been one of the casualties of 2008, and now he worked because not working meant not eating, which was a math problem a lot of people in Hearthlight understood intimately. James parked next to the building and killed the engine and sat for a moment in the silence, gathering himself for the day ahead. 4 transmission jobs waiting in the bay, 2 of them rush jobs that needed to be done by end of business today, and all of them requiring him to spend hours lying on his back on a creeper with his arms over his head while his spine screamed at him about how this was a terrible idea. But terrible ideas that paid $15 an hour were better than no ideas at all. And Hank had hired him 5 years ago when nobody else would, and had never asked questions about why a guy with a mechanical engineering degree was willing to work for wages that barely covered rent. The morning shift at the garage passed in a blur of wrenches and transmission fluid, and the particular kind of problem solving that came from trying to make broken things work again with whatever parts were available and whatever budget the customer could afford. James was good at this, better than good. His engineering degree, combined with his natural mechanical intuition, meant he could diagnose problems that left other mechanics scratching their heads. And more than once, Hank had called him over to look at something that should have been impossible to fix, but which James had somehow coaxed back into functionality through a combination of technical knowledge and stubborn refusal to accept that anything was truly unfixable. Around noon, during the 15-minute break that Hank allowed for lunch, James ate the peanut butter sandwich he'd made for himself, even thinner than Sophie's, because he needed the protein less than she did. And because going hungry was easier than watching your kid go hungry, and thought about the evening shift at Rosa's that would start in 4 hours and would run until 10 p.m. and would earn him another $40 plus tips that might add up to $20 if he was lucky, and if the weather didn't keep people home. $80 for 16 hours of work minus the taxes that would take a chunk he couldn't really spare, plus maybe 40 more tomorrow doing the same thing, plus Sophie's lunch money and the propane bill and the radiator that was getting worse and the driver's license renewal and the 100 other expenses that added up faster than the money came in. The math never quite worked, never had worked, probably never would work. But James had gotten good at juggling numbers the way he'd gotten good at juggling broken transmissions and coffee orders, and the careful balance between keeping his daughter fed and keeping himself functional enough to work the hours required to keep his daughter fed. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he was finishing the sandwich, and he pulled it out, expecting a message from Sophie's school or from Rosa about his shift tonight. But instead it was a text from Mrs. Rosa Martinez, their neighbor who lived in the apartment next to theirs in the converted farmhouse that James rented for $900 a month because it was the cheapest place in Hearthlight that had 2 bedrooms and indoor plumbing that mostly worked. Sophie asked if she could stay at my place after school today. Working on science project. I said yes, but wanted you to know. Rosa James smiled despite the exhaustion that made his face feel heavy. Mrs. Rosa Martinez was 73 years old and had been widowed for 15 years and lived on Social Security that probably wasn't much more than what James made at his 2 jobs. But she'd adopted him and Sophie as unofficial family from the moment they'd moved in 3 years ago. She watched Sophie when James's shifts ran late. She brought over food when she'd accidentally made too much. She offered advice about raising a daughter that James desperately needed because he'd never expected to do this alone and had no idea what he was doing most of the time. Thank you, Rosa. You're a lifesaver. I'll pick her up after my diner shift tonight. James, no rush, mijo. Take your time. Sophie is good company. Rosa, the afternoon at Hank's stretched into evening as the rush jobs took longer than expected, and the transmission on the second vehicle turned out to have problems beyond what the customer had described and what James had initially diagnosed. By the time he cleaned up and clocked out, it was already 5:30, and he had 30 minutes to get across town to Rosa's diner, where the evening shift started at 6 and where being late meant Rosa would give him that look of patient disappointment that somehow hurt worse than actual anger. He made it with 5 minutes to spare, pulling into the parking lot behind the diner, with his truck's engine making a new rattling sound that he added to the mental list of things that needed fixing as soon as he had time and money, which meant never. The diner was a long, narrow building that had been here since the 1950s and that still had the original chrome stools at the counter and the original red vinyl booths along the wall, though the vinyl had been patched so many times with duct tape that it looked like a map of some strange country where the borders were defined by tears in the fabric. Rosa Delgado was behind the counter when James came through the back door, and she looked up from the coffee she was pouring and gave him that smile that said she saw him trying and appreciated the effort even when the effort wasn't quite enough. She was 61 with gray hair pulled back in a bun and laugh lines around her eyes that came from 40 years of running a diner in a small town and dealing with the particular combination of joy and heartbreak that came from watching your community slowly crumble while you kept serving coffee and trying to make people feel like there was still something worth staying for. You look like hell, James. She didn't ask it, just stated it as fact. Long day. He tied the apron around his waist and checked the coffee station to see what needed refilling. Everything had turned out because the afternoon girl had apparently decided that restocking was optional. They're all long days for you. When's the last time you had a day off? James tried to remember and couldn't. March, maybe April. Sometime before summer, before Sophie's school had let out, and he'd had to figure out childcare for the weeks when Rosa Martinez wasn't available because she'd gone to visit her daughter in California. I'll take a day off when they start paying me to take days off. Rosa made a sound that was half sympathy and half exasperation, and then the dinner rush started, and there was no more time for conversation. From 6 to 9:30, James moved through the diner's narrow spaces with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for 5 years and who knew exactly how many steps it took to get from the kitchen to booth 6 and exactly how to balance 3 plates on one arm and exactly how to smile at customers who were complaining about the food or the service or the weather or their lives while making them feel like he actually cared about their complaints, even though mostly he was just trying to get through his shift without his back giving out completely. The tips were light tonight because the weather was keeping people home, and by the time he'd cleaned up and counted out his share $12.37, James was running the math on whether that was enough to justify the 4 hours of work. When you factored in the gas it took to get here, and the wear on his already dying truck, and the toll it took on his body to be upright and moving for 16 hours straight. But math didn't matter because Working meant eating, and eating meant Sophie stayed healthy, and Sophie staying healthy was the only equation that mattered. Rosa caught him before he left, pressing a plastic container into his hands. Leftover stew. I made too much. Take it home. They both knew she hadn't made too much, knew that she did this at least once a week, knew that this was Rosa's way of helping, without making James feel like he was accepting charity, even though that's exactly what it was. He took the container because refusing would hurt her feelings, and because Sophie would be excited to have real meat for dinner tomorrow, instead of the rice and beans they'd been rotating through for the past 2 weeks. Thank you, Rosa. This means he didn't finish the sentence because his throat had closed up unexpectedly, and because breaking down crying in front of his boss at 9:45 on a Friday night seemed like a bad idea, even if Rosa had seen him at his worst before and hadn't judged him for it. She patted his arm with her small, weathered hand and told him to get home safe and to give Sophie a hug for her. The drive home took him through Hearthlight's Main Street, which looked exactly like every small-town Main Street in America that had been gutted by Walmart and Amazon and the slow death of local economies. Half the storefronts were empty, their windows covered with plywood or newspaper, and the ones that were still operating, the dollar store, the check-cashing place, the pawn shop, weren't exactly symbols of community prosperity. The grocery store where James did his shopping with carefully clipped coupons would probably close within the next few years based on the rumors he'd heard, and then people would have to drive 30 miles to the next town to buy food, and Hearthlight would become one of those places that people drove through without stopping a footnote in Oregon's history of towns that had thrived once and now were just marking time until the last residents died or moved away. But it was home. It was where Sophie went to school and where Mrs. Rosa Martinez made him feel like he had family, and where the mechanics at Hank's knew his name and asked about his daughter and didn't treat him like he was less than human just because he was poor. It was where Lauren was buried, in the cemetery behind the Methodist church where James went every Sunday morning before his shift at the diner to tell her about Sophie's latest accomplishments and to apologize for not being able to give their daughter everything she deserved and to promise that he was still fighting, even when fighting felt pointless. Mrs. Martinez's apartment was on the second floor of the same building where James lived, and when he climbed the stairs, moving slowly because his back had finally hit the point where it was screaming, rather than just complaining, he could hear Sophie's voice through the thin walls, animated and excited, in a way that she rarely was at their own apartment, because their own apartment was small and cramped and full of reminders that they were broke. He knocked and waited, and Mrs. Martinez opened the door with a finger to her lips. She's asleep on the couch. Was working on that project until about 20 minutes ago, talking my ear off about airplanes and physics. That girl's brain, James, it's something special. Through the doorway, James could see Sophie curled up on Mrs. Martinez's worn sofa, her notebook still open on the coffee table, and her face peaceful in sleep in a way that made his chest ache, because she looked so young and so vulnerable and so completely dependent on him to keep her safe and fed and given opportunities that he had no idea how to provide. I'll carry her home. Thank you for what? For spending time with a brilliant young lady who reminds me of my granddaughters, for having company on a Friday night. You're doing me a favor, mijo. But they both knew the truth, knew that Mrs. Martinez was doing him the favor of providing childcare he couldn't afford to pay for and companionship for his daughter, that he wasn't home enough to provide, and a sense of stability that their own apartment lacked because James was always at work or asleep or trying to figure out how to stretch money that couldn't be stretched any further. He gathered Sophie into his arms. She was getting bigger, 12 now, instead of the 7-year-old she'd been when Lauren died, and carrying her required effort that made his back protest. And Mrs. Martinez draped Sophie's jacket over her and told James to be careful on the stairs. The walk down the hallway to their own apartment was only 50 feet, but with Sophie's weight and his back's complaints, and the exhaustion that was making his legs feel like they were made of concrete, it felt like 50 miles. Inside their apartment, he laid Sophie gently on her bed and pulled the blankets up around her shoulders and stood for a moment just watching her breathe, watching the rise and fall of her chest and the way her eyelashes rested against her cheeks and the way her hand curled around the edge of the blanket with the unconscious trust of a child who believed her father would keep her safe no matter what. He had no idea if he could keep her safe, had no idea if the truck would last another 6 months, or if Hank's shop would stay open, or if Rosa's diner would survive, or if the apartment building's landlord would decide to raise the rent, or if any of the thousand other disasters waiting in the wings would finally be the one that broke them. But standing here in the darkness with his daughter sleeping peacefully, James made the same promise he made every night. Whatever it took, however hard he had to work, however much pain he had to endure, he would keep fighting for her future. Even if that future seemed impossible, even if the math never worked out, even if he was so tired that his bones felt like they were dissolving, he would keep fighting because that's what fathers did, especially fathers who'd made a promise to a dying wife that their daughter would have every opportunity to fly as high as her brilliant mind could take her. James kissed Sophie's forehead gently and whispered the words he always whispered, "Love you, kiddo. Tomorrow's a new day." Then he stumbled to his own room and collapsed onto the bed without undressing, because undressing required energy he'd used up somewhere around hour 14 of his 16-hour day, and sleep took him under like a wave. 200 miles west in Portland, in a glass tower that rose 40 stories above the Willamette River and cost more per square foot than James Mitchell's entire farmhouse was worth, Catherine. Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office and watched the storm clouds gathering over the city. At 38, she was the founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies, a company she'd built from nothing 15 years ago with $5,000 in savings and an idea about neural interfaces that everyone had told her was impossible. The company was now valued at $30 billion. Its Phoenix System neural interface had the potential to change the lives of millions of people with paralysis or motor impairments. Catherine herself was worth, according to the most recent Forbes estimate, somewhere around $8 billion personally, though the number fluctuated based on stock prices and market conditions, and 1,000 other factors that had stopped mattering to her sometime around the point where she'd realized that having money couldn't buy health. The office around her was a temple to success rendered in glass and steel and minimalist furniture that had been selected by an interior designer who charged more for a consultation than James Mitchell made in a year. The walls were covered in awards and framed magazine covers and photographs of Catherine with presidents and tech billionaires and Nobel laureates. Her desk was a slab of reclaimed wood that had cost $40,000 and held 3 computer monitors that gave her real-time access to every aspect of Horizon's operations across 12 countries. The view from her windows encompassed the river and the bridges and the mountains beyond, a vista that real estate agents described as priceless, and that Catherine barely noticed anymore because views didn't matter when you spent most of your time looking at screens or fighting your own body's betrayal. Her right hand trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee cup on her desk, and she watched the tremor with the clinical detachment of someone who'd spent 3 years studying her own symptoms the way she'd once studied engineering problems. Early onset Parkinson's disease diagnosed 3 years ago when she was 35, and at the absolute peak of her career, launching Horizon's first major product and being featured in Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in technology. The neurologist had been kind but direct. This was progressive degenerative, currently manageable with medication, but eventually not manageable, eventually debilitating, eventually the kind of disease that stole your ability to walk and speak and feed yourself and left you trapped in a body that had become a prison. There were treatments, the neurologist had said. There were medications and therapies and experimental procedures. There was hope, carefully qualified, hope, the kind of hope that medical professionals offered when they knew the odds were bad but didn't want to completely destroy their patient's will to keep fighting. Catherine had listened to all of this with the same focused intensity she brought to board meetings and investor presentations. And then she'd gone back to her office and done what she always did when faced with a problem that seemed insurmountable. She decided to engineer a solution. The Phoenix System neural interface hadn't started as a solution to her own problems. The initial research had been about helping people with spinal cord injuries and ALS and other conditions that left the mind intact but the body unable to respond to the mind's commands. But somewhere during the development process, as Catherine's own tremors had gotten worse and her own future had become increasingly uncertain, the project had become personal in a way that she'd never admitted to anyone except her assistant Daniel and the lead engineer, Dr. Patricia Reeves. If she could build a system that would let people control computers and robotic limbs and communication devices with nothing but their thoughts and the smallest movements their bodies could still make, then maybe when her own Parkinson's progressed to the point where she couldn't type or write or speak clearly, she'd still be able to work and communicate and maintain some measure of control over her existence. It was, she knew, a form of denial. The Phoenix system wasn't a cure. It was a workaround, a technological accommodation, a way of postponing the inevitable rather than preventing it. But postponing was better than surrendering, and Catherine had never been good at surrender. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom crisp and professional. "Ms. Sterling, the board is ready for you." Catherine straightened her shoulders and slipped the mask of confidence back into place. The mask she wore in public that hid the tremors and the fear, and the nights when she lay awake wondering if she'd live long enough to see the Phoenix system actually help people, or if she'd become one of its patients before it was ready for clinical trials. She gathered her tablet, the only device that contained the most sensitive blueprints and research data for Phoenix encrypted beyond anything that commercial security could break, and walked toward the conference room, where 12 directors sat waiting to judge whether her latest quarterly projections justified their continued investment. The boardroom was exactly what you'd expect from a $30 billion company, long table of polished mahogany leather chairs that cost more than cars' walls of glass that made you feel like you were floating above the city. The directors were mostly men over 50, though Catherine had fought to add 3 women and 2 people under 40 over the past 5 years. They wore suits that whispered money and carried tablets that whispered power and had expressions that whispered skepticism about whether a woman who'd inherited nothing except ambition from her immigrant parents could really sustain the success she'd built. Catherine had learned to ignore the whispers, or rather she'd learned to use them as fuel, converting doubt into determination and condescension into competitive fire. She'd spent 15 years proving to rooms full of powerful men that she belonged at the head of the table, and she'd do it for another 15 or 50 or however long it took until they finally accepted that she wasn't an anomaly or an outlier, but simply someone who was better at this than they were. The presentation she gave over the next hour touched on quarterly earnings and market projections and the timeline for Phoenix Systems clinical trials in the competitive landscape, and a dozen other topics that board members needed to hear in order to feel confident that their investments were being managed competently. Catherine spoke with calm precision, her voice never wavering. Her data meticulously organized, her responses to questions demonstrating the kind of detailed knowledge that came from being personally involved in every aspect of the company rather than just sitting in an office delegating to subordinates. But halfway through the presentation, when she was discussing the planned demonstration for investors in Oregon next week, the chairman of the board, Gerald Whitmore, 67, old money from California, skeptical of tech companies in general, and female CEOs in particular, interrupted with the kind of question that wasn't really a question, so much as a thinly veiled criticism wrapped in concern. "Catherine, I notice you're planning to pilot yourself to the Oregon meetings. The forecast is calling for severe storms all week. Perhaps it would be prudent to hire a professional crew or reschedule for when conditions are more favorable." The implication was clear. You're taking unnecessary risks. You're letting your personal preferences override good business sense. You're not exercising the kind of cautious judgment we expect from someone running a $30 billion company. Catherine had heard variations of this criticism for 15 years, always delivered in tones that suggested the speaker was just trying to help, just offering friendly advice, just expressing reasonable concern rather than reinforcing the subtle message that women couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about risk. She met Whitmore's eyes and held them while she delivered her response with the kind of measured calm that she'd perfected for exactly these moments. "I appreciate your concern, Gerald. However, I've been flying since I was 16. I have over 2,000 hours in the air, including extensive instrument training for adverse weather conditions. The forecast is concerning but manageable for someone with my experience, and rescheduling would cost us critical momentum with investors who've already arranged their schedules around next week's demonstration. I'll be monitoring conditions closely and will make whatever adjustments are necessary to ensure safety, but I'm confident the flight is within acceptable risk parameters." What she didn't say, what she never said in these meetings, was that flying was one of the few activities where the Parkinsons didn't matter yet, where her hands on the controls and her mind focused on navigation and her body pressed back into the pilot seat by acceleration made her feel like herself rather than like someone slowly being erased by a malfunctioning nervous system. What she didn't say was that the cockpit was one of the last places where she felt completely in control of her life, and giving that up because some old man thought women couldn't handle storms felt like surrendering more than just a flight plan. Whitmore looked like he wanted to press the point, but the other board members were already moving on to the next agenda item, and the moment passed. The rest of the meeting proceeded without incident, and by the time Catherine returned to her office 90 minutes later, she'd successfully defended her quarterly numbers and her Phoenix timeline, and her right to fly her own plane through weather that might or might not be as bad as the forecast predicted. Daniel was waiting in her office with the afternoon schedule and a concerned expression that suggested he'd heard about the flight plan discussion and had opinions he wanted to share. Catherine forestalled him by holding up one hand. I know what you're going to say. The answer is no. I'm flying myself to Oregon on Thursday. The Phoenix demonstration is happening Friday morning, and I'll be back in Portland by Friday night. If the weather is genuinely dangerous, I'll file an alternate route or reschedule, but I'm not hiring a crew and I'm not canceling the demonstration because Gerald Whitmore thinks women shouldn't fly in storms. Daniel Chen was 32, brilliant, loyal, and one of exactly 3 people at Horizon who knew about Catherine's Parkinson's diagnosis. He'd been her first hire when she'd started the company and had stayed through every crisis and near bankruptcy and breakthrough that had marked their path from startup to empire. He was also willing to tell her when she was being stupid, which made him more valuable than any of the yes men who populated most executive suites. I wasn't going to say you shouldn't fly. His voice was careful, diplomatic. I was going to say that if you're going to fly through a storm system that's already killed 2 people in Washington, you should at least take the backup communication equipment and file emergency alternates for every airport within 100 miles of your route. Catherine felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. This was why Daniel was irreplaceable. He knew when to push and when to support, and when to find the middle ground between her stubbornness and his concern. Already done. I filed the flight plan this morning with 3 alternates, and I'm taking the full emergency kit, including the satellite beacon and the survival gear. I'm careful, Daniel. I'm just not going to be prevented from doing something I'm qualified to do because people make assumptions about my capabilities based on my gender. Or based on the fact that you're running on 4 hours of sleep and 3 cups of coffee and you've been working 18-hour days for the past month. Catherine almost smiled. Or that, but running on too little sleep is basically the tech industry's defining characteristic. So if that disqualified people from flying planes, half of Silicon Valley would be grounded. They reviewed the rest of the afternoon's business calls with investors' updates from the engineering team, revisions to the Phoenix demonstration script, and then Daniel left her alone in her office where she stood once more at the windows watching the storm clouds build over the mountains. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandfather, the only family she had left since her father had died in a car accident 15 years ago, and her mother had followed him 2 years later, lost to the grief that sometimes killed as surely as any disease. Xiao Yun, be careful flying in this weather. Your Ye worries about you. Grandfather Catherine smiled at the screen. Her grandfather still called her by her Chinese name, Xiao Yun Little Cloud, the name her father had given her before deciding that Catherine would be easier for American teachers to pronounce. At 87, he was the last connection to her parents and to the electronics repair shop they'd run in Portland's Chinatown before her father had saved enough to send her to MIT, and before the car accident had ended, his dreams of seeing his daughter become an engineer. I'll be careful, Ye. Promise. Love you, Catherine. She set the phone down and returned to work, reviewing the Phoenix system specifications for the 100th time, looking for weaknesses or failure points, or anything that could go wrong during Friday's demonstration in front of investors who were expecting perfection. The system was elegant in its complexity. Neural sensors that could detect the faintest electrical signals from the brain machine learning algorithms that could translate those signals into commands for external devices. Interfaces that required nothing more than thought and the tiniest movement of an eye or a finger to control computers and robotic arms and communication systems. For people whose bodies had betrayed them, Phoenix meant independence. It meant the ability to work and create and communicate without depending on caregivers to interpret their needs. It meant dignity and autonomy and the possibility of building lives that weren't defined entirely by medical limitations. And for Catherine, if she was honest with herself, in the moments when the mask of CEO confidence slipped, it meant hope. Hope that when her own body's betrayal reached the point where she couldn't type or write or speak without effort, she'd still have a way to work and lead and contribute rather than being forced into retirement by a disease that was stealing her future one tremor at a time. The evening passed in the familiar rhythm of work and occasional breaks to take medication or stretch or stand at the windows and watch the city lights reflect off the river. By 10 p.m., Catherine was alone in the office tower, the cleaning crew having finished hours ago, the security guard downstairs having checked in via intercom to make sure she knew she was the last person in the building. She should go home to the penthouse apartment that overlooked the river and cost more per month than most people in Oregon made in a year. She should sleep, should eat something more substantial than the protein bar she'd had for dinner, should take care of herself the way the neurologist kept telling her to take care of herself because stress made the Parkinson's worse and exhaustion made everything worse, and she was going to burn out if she didn't learn to maintain some kind of balance. But balance felt like surrender, felt like admitting that she couldn't do everything she'd always done, felt like the first step on a path that led to disability and dependence and all the things she'd spent 3 years running from. So instead of going home, Catherine pulled up the Phoenix system specifications one more time and lost herself in the beautiful complexity of engineering problems that had clear solutions, unlike the biological problem that was slowly destroying her nervous system and that no amount of brilliance or determination could solve. Thursday morning arrived with rain that had been falling since midnight and showed no signs of stopping. Catherine woke at 5 a.m. in her apartment, showered, dressed in the kind of practical clothing that worked for flying jeans, sweater, leather, jacket, and stood in front of her bedroom mirror, examining her reflection with the critical eye she'd learned to bring to everything in her life. The face looking back at her was still recognizably the same face that had been photographed for magazine covers and investor presentations, but there were differences that only she noticed. The slight hollowing under her cheekbones from weight she'd lost, because medication sometimes made eating feel like a chore. The tightness around her eyes from nights when sleep came late, or not at all, the careful way she held her hands to minimize the visible tremor that she'd gotten better at hiding, but never better at accepting. She took her morning medication with water from the kitchen tap and ate a protein bar that tasted like cardboard because everything tasted like cardboard when you ate it purely as fuel rather than pleasure. Then she packed her bag, overnight clothes, toiletries, the tablet with Phoenix specifications, the backup medications her neurologist insisted she carry everywhere, and headed down to the building's garage where her car, a sensible Tesla, rather than the sports cars some tech CEOs favored, waited in its assigned spot. The drive to Portland Hillsborough Airport took 30 minutes through weather that was getting progressively worse, rain turning to horizontal sheets, driven by wind that made the Tesla's autopilot disengage with a warning that conditions were outside safe parameters. Catherine switched to manual control and felt the familiar focus that came from driving in adverse conditions, the same focus that made flying feel like meditation rather than stress. At the airport, her plane, a Cirrus SR-22 single-engine, not flashy but reliable and capable, sat waiting in the hangar where she kept it maintained to standards that exceeded what the FAA required, because Catherine's approach to risk was that you eliminated it wherever possible, and then you had backup plans for when elimination wasn't possible. She did the pre-flight inspection with meticulous care, checking fuel levels and oil pressure and control surfaces, and every other component that could determine whether this flight ended safely or ended as a statistic. The weather briefing from flight service confirmed what she already knew: storms moving in from the Pacific, heavy rain turbulence, low ceilings conditions that were legal for instrument flight, but not comfortable even for experienced pilots. Catherine filed her flight plan with alternates and emergency contacts and got clearance from the tower, and then she climbed into the cockpit and went through the startup checklist with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. The engine caught on the first try gauges showing nominal readings, and Catherine felt the familiar sense of peace that came from being in a cockpit where everything made sense and everything responded predictably to her inputs. This was her space, her domain, the place where she was simply a pilot rather than a CEO or a Parkinson's patient, or a woman trying to prove she belonged in rooms full of men who thought she didn't. She keyed the radio Hillsborough Ground Cirrus 427 Tango, Charlie ready to taxi for departure to Heartfelt Municipal. The tower came back with taxi instructions and a warning about conditions deteriorating along her route, and Catherine acknowledged and began the careful process of taxiing through rain that was heavy enough to reduce visibility even on the ground. At the runway, she waited for clearance and used the time to go through her mental checklist one more time, confirming that everything was ready and that she'd accounted for every variable she could account for. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Catherine pushed the throttle forward, feeling the acceleration press her back into the seat, feeling the wheels leave the ground, feeling the moment of transition from earthbound to airborne that never got old, no matter how many times she experienced it. The cirrus climbed into clouds that turned the world into gray nothing, and Catherine switched her focus to instruments and navigation as the ground disappeared below and the sky disappeared above, and she entered the strange, suspended existence of instrument flight, where the only reality was what the gauges told you, and trusting those gauges was the difference between life and death. The flight plan called for 90 minutes to reach Hearthlight, a small farming community in eastern Oregon, where the investors she was meeting owned agricultural businesses and wanted to see how Phoenix could help farm workers who'd been injured in accidents that left them with limited mobility. It was exactly the kind of demonstration that could generate the emotional response investors needed to commit serious money, exactly the kind of story that could help Phoenix move from prototype to product. But 20 minutes into the flight, the weather that had been bad became worse. Turbulence that made the cirrus buck and roll, rain so heavy it overwhelmed the de-icing systems, wind that pushed her off course and required constant corrections to maintain heading. Catherine's hands were steady on the controls. This was what training was for, what experience prepared you for, but some part of her mind was tracking the deterioration and calculating whether continuing was prudent or whether the prudent choice was to divert to one of her alternates. 40 minutes into the flight, the decision was made for her when the engine began running rough. Not failing, not yet, but stumbling in a way that meant something was wrong with fuel delivery or ignition, and that continuing toward Hearthlight was no longer a question of comfort, but a question of whether she'd make it at all. Catherine keyed the radio, Portland Center, Cirrus 427 Tango. Charlie, I'm experiencing engine roughness and need to divert to nearest suitable airport. The controller came back immediately, professional concern in his voice. 7 Tango Charlie, understand engine problems. Nearest suitable is Hearthlight Municipal, 30 miles at your 2 o'clock. Advise if you need emergency services, standing by. Negative on emergency services at this time. Just precautionary diversion due to rough running. Catherine's voice was calm because panic in the cockpit killed people, and calm helped you think through problems systematically. She adjusted her heading toward Hearthlight and began descending out of the clouds, trying to keep the engine running smoothly, trying to maintain altitude, trying to calculate whether 30 miles was too far, if the engine quit entirely because 30 miles was a long glide in a single-engine aircraft, and the terrain below was farmland, with not many good options for emergency landing sites. The engine stumbled, again coughed, and Catherine's training took over completely. She set up for best glide speed, picked out potential landing sites, mentally rehearsed the emergency procedures she'd practiced hundreds of times in simulators, but never in actual flight. The clouds below were breaking up enough that she could see the ground, now fields and forests, and the occasional farm building, but visibility was still terrible and the rain was still heavy, and her options were narrowing rapidly. 5 miles from Hearthlight, the engine quit entirely. No warning, no gradual failure, just a sudden silence that was one of the most terrifying sounds a pilot could experience. Catherine's hands moved automatically through the restart procedure, fuel selector, mixture, magnetos, primer, but the engine refused to restart, and she was now committed to landing somewhere in the next 3 minutes, whether she wanted to or not. She spotted a field that looked relatively flat, oriented herself to use what little wind advantage she could get, and began the approach that was less an approach and more than a controlled descent toward impact. Her hands weren't shaking. Her mind was clear. This was what training was for. This was what all those hours in simulators and practicing emergency procedures had prepared her for. The Cirrus touched down in the field doing 70 knots, which was too fast but unavoidable, and immediately the wheels hit mud that grabbed them and tried to flip the aircraft. Catherine fought the controls, trying to keep the wings level, trying to prevent a cartwheel that would kill her instantly. The landing gear collapsed, the nose dug into mud, and suddenly the aircraft was spinning and sliding and tearing itself apart around her. The impact was something solid, a rock, a fence post. Something that was stronger than the Cirrus's aluminum structure brought the spin to a sudden stop and brought Catherine's head forward into the instrument panel despite the seatbelt. Pain exploded across her forehead. Her right arm bent at an angle that arms weren't supposed to bend. And then she was just sitting in the wreckage, dazed, bleeding alive, against odds that had not been in her favor. Smoke was rising from the engine compartment. Bad. Very bad. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant explosion, and explosion meant she had maybe 60 seconds to get out if she could move, and maybe less if she couldn't. Catherine tried the door, but it was jammed, twisted metal holding it shut, and her right arm wasn't working properly, and she couldn't get enough leverage to force it open. She was going to die here. After everything, building a company, from nothing, fighting Parkinson's, refusing to give up or give in, she was going to die in a cornfield because she couldn't open a door, and because fire was coming, and because sometimes you did everything right and it still wasn't enough. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, she saw lights approaching, vehicle lights, someone coming toward the wreckage. Her last thought before consciousness started to fade was absurd hope that whoever was coming would get there in time, combined with resignation that they probably wouldn't because fire didn't care about hope, and physics didn't care about determination, and death came when it came regardless of whether you were ready. Then everything went dark. James Mitchell was halfway through the drive home from Rose's diner when the sky decided to stop threatening and start delivering. Rain that had been falling steadily all evening suddenly intensified into sheets of water, driven sideways by wind that made his truck shake and fishtail on the muddy county road. He slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 20, then 15, because visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and because dying in a ditch because you were too stubborn to drive carefully seemed like a particularly stupid way to leave Sophie orphaned. The wipers thrashed back and forth with manic urgency, but never quite managed to clear the windshield before the next wave of rain obscured everything again. Lightning split the darkness with frequency that suggested the storm was directly overhead, and each flash illuminated the familiar landscape in stark white relief cornfields that belonged to the Hendersons' pasture land that used to be productive before the Johnsons lost their dairy operation, the old Miller property that had been abandoned for 3 years since the bank foreclosed. He was thinking about whether the propane tank at home had enough fuel to keep the heat running through the weekend when the lightning revealed something that didn't belong in the landscape. An aircraft's small and low wings tilting violently as wind hammered it from multiple directions simultaneously. James's brain took a second to process what his eyes were seeing because small planes didn't fly in storms like this, didn't fly this low, unless something had gone catastrophically wrong, didn't belong in the sky above Hearthlight on a Thursday night when any sane pilot would have stayed grounded. Then the plane's engine coughed, a sound he could hear even through the truck's cab in the storm's fury, and James understood with the crystalline clarity that came from 10 years of military training that he was about to witness a crash. And that witness was probably all he could do because you couldn't stop a falling aircraft any more than you could stop gravity or time or any of the other forces that killed people without caring about their plans or dreams or the families waiting for them to come home. He grabbed his phone and punched 911 while simultaneously pulling onto the shoulder because whatever was about to happen would require emergency response and might require him to do something other than just stand there watching someone die. The dispatcher answered on the second ring with professional calm that suggested she'd handled worse situations than this one. "This is James Mitchell calling from County Road 27 near the old Miller property. There's a small aircraft in distress. Looks like engine failure coming down fast in the fields just north of my position." His voice was steady because Army Rangers didn't panic in emergencies, because panic made you stupid, and stupid made you dead because somewhere in the past 15 years, between Kandahar and Hearthlight, he'd learned to compress fear into a manageable box that could be opened later when there wasn't someone's life depending on whether you kept your head together. The dispatcher was asking questions: what type of aircraft, how many people on board, exact location. But James was already out of the truck and running toward where the plane had disappeared below the tree line because the dispatcher's questions weren't going to help whoever was in that cockpit. And running might, even though running through a cornfield in a thunderstorm toward a crash site was objectively insane by any reasonable standard. The sound when the plane hit the ground was wrong in ways that made James's stomach clench. Metal and earth combining into a noise that spoke of impact forces measured in G-forces that human bodies weren't designed to survive. Then came the secondary sound of something structural, failing wings tearing away from fuselage, and then the whoomph of fuel igniting, because of course there was fire, because crashes in movies always had fire, and apparently crashes in real life did too. James vaulted a fence that separated the road from the Hendersons' cornfield, and his back screamed at him about how this was a terrible idea, but he ignored it because his back screamed at him about everything, and right now someone was burning to death unless he got there fast enough to matter. The mud grabbed at his boots with each step, trying to slow him down, trying to make him reconsider this impulse toward heroism that was probably going to get him killed or, at minimum, seriously injured. Through the rain and darkness, he could see flames licking at wreckage that had torn a gash through standing corn, and the smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with smoke created the particular scent of disaster that James remembered from Iraq when helicopters had crashed and burned, and people had screamed until they couldn't scream anymore. He pushed the memory down because memories didn't help, and being present helped, and right now present meant getting to that cockpit before the fire spread from engine to passenger compartment. The aircraft had broken apart on impact, the nose crumpled and twisted, the wings separated, and lying in pieces across 50 yards of devastated field. But the fuselage was intact enough that James could see movement inside the cockpit, someone alive and trying to get free from wreckage that had become a trap. He reached the door and grabbed the handle, but it didn't budge, bent metal, holding it closed with the grip of something that physics said wasn't moving without leverage and tools that James didn't have. He braced his feet in mud that came up to his ankles and pulled with strength that came from desperation more than muscle, and the door gave maybe an inch before stopping again. Inside the cockpit, he could see a woman slumped against restraints, blood on her face, eyes closed. And the fire was spreading faster now because fuel was everywhere, and fire didn't care about James's determination or the woman's need to survive or anything except consuming whatever it could reach. "Can you hear me? I'm getting you out." His voice was loud enough to cut through the storm and the fire's roar, and the woman's eyes fluttered open for a second before closing again, which meant conscious or semi-conscious, which meant there was someone in there to save if he could just get this door open before the flames reached the cockpit and turned rescue into recovery. James reset his grip and pulled again, throwing his weight backward, feeling something in his lower back pop in a way that suggested he'd just done permanent damage to vertebrae that were already damaged. But the door moved another inch and then another, and suddenly it came free all at once, and James fell backward into the mud with the door still in his hands. He scrambled up and reached into the cockpit where the woman was held in place by a 5-point harness that took him precious seconds to figure out because civilian aircraft harnesses were different from military harnesses, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline even though his mind was calm. The release clicked, and the woman fell forward, and James caught her one arm under her knees and the other behind her back in the classic carry that soldiers learned for evacuating wounded and that he hadn't used in 14 years, but which apparently was one of those skills that muscle memory never forgot. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in his arms despite the leather jacket and the competence that flying an aircraft implied, and her right arm was bent at an angle that made James's combat medic training scream at him about compound fractures and nerve damage, and all the ways that injuries led to permanent disability. But none of that mattered as much as the fact that flames were now visible through the cockpit glass and that he needed to get distance between them and the aircraft before the fuel tank went up and turned this rescue into a suicide mission. He staggered backward, through the mud, each step an effort because the woman's weight combined with his own exhaustion, combined with terrain that wanted to swallow his feet, made movement feel like wading through concrete. Behind him, the fire intensified with a sound like an angry beast waking up, and James's military training was screaming at him to move faster. Get more distance because fuel tanks didn't burn indefinitely before exploding, and when they exploded, the shrapnel and fireball and pressure wave didn't discriminate between rescuer and victim. The explosion when it came was exactly as loud and violent as James had feared, heat slamming into his back with force that knocked him forward off his feet. He twisted as he fell, using his body to shield the woman he was carrying, hitting the ground with his shoulder and hip, while keeping her above the mud and protected from impact. Debris rained down around them, pieces of metal and plastic and composite materials that had been aircraft components seconds ago and were now just dangerous projectiles obeying gravity's commands. James curled himself around the woman and waited for the debris storm to pass, feeling impacts against his back and legs, but nothing that felt like it had penetrated deeply enough to be immediately lethal. When the rain of wreckage finally stopped, he checked her breathing and found it shallow, but present, checked her pulse and found it rapid but steady, and felt relief flood through him with intensity that made his hands shake because she was alive. And he'd gotten her out, and maybe this time he'd saved someone instead of just watching them die. The walk back to the farmhouse took 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours, James carrying the unconscious woman through rain that had somehow gotten heavier through mud, that grabbed at his boots with each step through darkness, that was broken only by lightning that showed him terrain he knew by heart, but which looked alien and threatening in the storm. His back was sending signals that suggested he'd torn muscles, or damaged discs, or done something that was going to require medical attention he couldn't afford. But pain was just information. And right now, the information that mattered was that each step forward was a step towards shelter and help. The farmhouse lights were visible from half a mile away, yellow rectangles in the darkness that meant home and safety and the end of this particular crisis. James adjusted his grip on the woman. His arms were cramping from holding her weight for this long, and pushed through the last section of field that separated him from the house where Sophie and Mrs. Martinez would be waiting, and where he could finally stop moving and let someone else take over the burden of keeping this stranger alive. The porch steps were slick with rain, and James took them carefully because falling now, after making it this far, would be the kind of stupid tragedy that got written up in local newspapers as cautionary tales. The door opened before he reached it. Sophie standing there with eyes wide and scared, in a way that made James's heart clench, because 12-year-olds shouldn't have to see their fathers looking like drowned rats carrying unconscious women through thunderstorms. "Dad, what happened?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and James wanted to stop and hug her and reassure her that everything was going to be fine. But his arms were giving out, and the woman was slipping, and he needed to get inside before he dropped her. "Plane crash in the field. Call 911 again. Tell them we have the pilot and she needs help right away." Sophie disappeared toward the phone while Mrs. Martinez materialized from the kitchen with the expression of someone who'd seen enough emergencies in 73 years that one more wasn't going to break her composure. She helped James clear the couch in the living room, throwing quilts down to protect against mud and blood, and together they lowered the woman onto cushions that sagged under her weight. The fire in the wood stove was burning low but steady, providing warmth that the woman desperately needed because her skin was cold to the touch, in a way that suggested shock or hypothermia or both. James went through the assessment procedures that Army medic training had drilled into him until they were automatic airway, clear breathing present, circulation adequate but rapid. Obvious injuries included head trauma and what looked like a badly broken right arm, and probably internal injuries. He couldn't assess without equipment he didn't have. Mrs. Martinez appeared beside him with towels and the battered first aid kit that James kept in the bathroom and had used more times than he wanted to remember for Sophie's scraped knees and his own various injuries. He cleaned the wound on the woman's forehead with antiseptic that made her stir, but not wake, revealing a gash that probably needed stitches, but which James closed with butterfly bandages because stitches required doctors and doctors required ambulances that apparently weren't coming anytime soon based on what Sophie was reporting from her phone conversation with dispatch. They said the storm has everything backed up. Ambulances are dealing with accidents all over the county. Might be hours before they can get here. Sophie's voice was small and scared, and James looked up from bandaging to meet his daughter's eyes and tried to project calm he didn't feel. "Then we do what we can until help arrives. You did good calling them, kiddo. Now I need you to be brave a little longer, okay?" The woman's arm required more care than James was qualified to provide, but he did what he could, straightening it gently, immobilizing it with a splint made from a broken yardstick and an old elastic bandage, trying not to cause more damage while preventing the damage that was already done from getting worse. The whole time he worked, he was conscious of Sophie watching from the doorway, learning lessons about emergency response and keeping calm under pressure and doing what needed to be done, even when you were scared, lessons that James had never wanted to teach her, but which life seemed determined to provide anyway. By midnight, the woman was stable enough that James felt comfortable sitting back and taking stock of his own condition, which turned out to be worse than he'd thought while adrenaline was masking the damage. His back was locked up in spasms that made breathing difficult, his shoulder had a deep bruise from hitting the ground during the explosion, and his hands were shaking with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the emotional toll of pulling someone out of burning wreckage. Miss Martinez made coffee that was stronger than anything Rosa served at the diner, and James drank it while watching the woman sleep and wondering who she was and why she'd been flying in conditions that had nearly killed her and whether she had family somewhere who were worried about her disappearance. The wallet in her jacket pocket would have answered some of those questions, but going through her belongings while she was unconscious felt like a violation of privacy that James wasn't willing to commit even for the sake of information. Sophie eventually fell asleep in the armchair that had been her mother's favorite spot for reading her notebook, still open on her lap, to sketches of aircraft that looked eerily similar to the wreckage burning in the Henderson's field right now. Mrs. Martinez dozed beside her with rosary beads moving slowly through her fingers in prayers that James hoped were being heard by someone or something that had the power to make any of this turn out better than it currently looked like it was going to turn out. And James sat vigil through the small hours of Friday morning, watching the woman breathe and adjusting her blankets when she shivered and thinking about how life could change in seconds. How you could be flying through a storm one moment and lying unconscious on a stranger's couch the next. How the distance between being alive and being dead was sometimes just a matter of whether someone happened to be driving past at the right moment and was stupid enough or brave enough or crazy enough to run toward fire instead of away from it. Sometime around 3 a.m., the woman stirred eyelids fluttering open to reveal dark eyes that were unfocused with pain and confusion. She tried to sit up, but James leaned forward and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe. Your plane went down, but you're alive, and you're in my home. Just stay still and let your body rest." Her lips moved and sound came out, but it was too quiet for James to understand, so he leaned closer until he could hear her whisper with urgency that suggested whatever she was trying to say mattered more than her obvious pain. "My tablet. It was on board." The words didn't make immediate sense to James, who cared about tablets, when you just survived a plane crash, but the intensity in her eyes suggested it mattered to her in ways he couldn't understand and might not be able to fix, because if the tablet had been on board, then the tablet was currently ash and melted plastic somewhere in the wreckage. "I'll look for it when it's light. Right now you need to rest and let your injuries heal." Her eyes closed again, and she sank back into unconsciousness or sleep, or whatever state people occupied when their bodies were trying to recover from trauma. James resettled the blanket around her and returned to his vigil, wondering what could be important enough about a tablet that it was the first thing you thought about after nearly dying. Morning came slowly, gray light seeping through windows that were streaked with rain that had finally slowed from deluge to drizzle. The woman woke more fully this time, aware enough to take in her surroundings with a systematic scan of someone assessing situation and threat level. Her voice was hoarse but stronger when she spoke. "Where am I?" James answered from his chair, where he'd spent the night dozing in 15-minute increments between checks on her breathing and pulse and the color of her lips. "My home about 5 miles outside Hearthlight. Your plane came down in the field next to my property last night. Engine failure from what I could tell before the fire consumed everything." She touched the bandage on her forehead with her left hand, then looked at the splint on her right arm with an expression that suggested she was cataloging injuries and calculating recovery time with a detached assessment of someone who'd been trained to think analytically, even under stress. "Thank you for pulling me out. I remember fire and someone telling me to stay still." "That was you," James nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt disproportionate to what he'd done, because pulling people out of burning vehicles was something any decent human would have done and didn't deserve thanks any more than breathing deserved thanks. "What's your name?" The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected him to know who she was, but after a moment she responded with words that sounded formal, despite her obvious exhaustion. "Catherine Sterling, and it seems I owe you my life, Mr. Mitchell." "James Mitchell. And you don't owe me anything except maybe getting yourself looked at by actual doctors, because I'm just a mechanic with Army medic training and I've done all I can do for that arm." Movement from the doorway announced Sophie's arrival, hair tangled from sleep and eyes still carrying the fear from last night, but also curiosity about the stranger on their couch. Catherine's gaze shifted to the girl, and something in her expression softened in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had seconds before. "And who might you be?" James made introductions with the awkward formality of someone who wasn't used to having house guests, especially house guests he'd rescued from plane crashes. Sophie approached cautiously the way she approached all new situations, but her natural curiosity was already overcoming her shyness. "Is that your science project on the table?" Catherine's voice carried genuine interest, rather than the patronizing tone adults often use with children. Sophie brightened immediately, launching into an explanation of aerodynamics and lift generation that revealed more technical knowledge than most seventh graders possessed. Catherine listened with focus that suggested she actually understood what Sophie was explaining and found it interesting rather than just pretending for politeness. They talked about wing design and pressure differentials and Reynolds numbers while James watched his daughter come alive in ways she rarely did at school, where being smart was less valuable than being popular. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made James tense, with instinctive alertness, vehicles approaching on the unpaved driveway that led to the farmhouse, multiple vehicles moving in convoy formation. He stood and moved to the window, expecting ambulances finally arriving to transport Catherine to the hospital, but what he saw instead made him freeze with incomprehension. Black SUVs, at least five of them, rolling down his driveway like a presidential motorcade, and overhead the unmistakable thump of helicopter rotors cutting through morning air. For a man whose world consisted of two-job poverty and struggling to keep his daughter fed, the sight was surreal to the point of feeling like hallucination. Sophie pressed her face against the window beside him, voice carrying wonder and nervousness in equal measure. "Dad, there are actual helicopters. Multiple helicopters." Mrs. Martinez appeared from the kitchen where she'd been making breakfast and crossed herself while murmuring something in Spanish that James couldn't quite hear, but which sounded like prayers about angels, or possibly demons, depending on whether you thought armed escorts arriving at dawn were salvation or invasion. Behind them, Catherine shifted on the couch, and James heard her say something that didn't immediately register because he was still processing the SUVs and helicopters and the men in suits and earpieces who were emerging from vehicles with the practiced efficiency of security personnel who knew their jobs were protecting something valuable. "That would be my team. I should have expected they'd track my emergency beacon." James turned to stare at her with dawning comprehension that was rapidly being replaced by something closer to shock. "Your team. Just how important are you that you travel with security details and helicopters?" Catherine met his eyes with expression that suggested she'd had this conversation before and knew how it was going to play out. "I'm the CEO of Horizon Technologies. The company is worth about $30 billion, and the project I was flying to present is worth considerably more than that. So yes, I travel with security when I'm carrying sensitive information, which I always am." The name Horizon Technologies meant nothing to James initially, but Sophie's gasp of recognition made him realize this was something he should know about, something that existed in the world of technology and innovation that he'd left behind when medical bills and funeral costs had turned his mechanical engineering degree into expensive wallpaper. "You're Catherine Sterling, the Catherine Sterling who invented the Phoenix system." Sophie's voice was reverential in a way that made James feel like he'd somehow failed as a father by not knowing who was lying on his couch. But in his defense, he'd been focused on keeping her alive rather than researching her credentials. The first of the security personnel reached the porch and knocked with authority that suggested this wasn't a request so much as an announcement that they were coming in whether James invited them or not. He opened the door to find a man in his 30s wearing a suit that cost more than James's truck and an expression of relief mixed with professional assessment. "Miss Sterling, we've been trying to locate you since your emergency beacon activated. Are you injured?" The man's eyes had already cataloged the splint and bandages and the way Catherine was favoring her left side, and James could see him making calculations about medical evacuation and liability and all the things that corporate executives worried about when their boss nearly died in a plane crash. Catherine's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone who was used to being in charge, even when circumstances suggested she shouldn't be. "I'm fine, Daniel, thanks to Mr. Mitchell here who pulled me from the wreckage before it exploded. If not for him, you'd be meeting a very different outcome this morning." Daniel's gaze shifted to James with assessment that was probably measuring him against categories that included potential litigation and media exposure, and whether the random mechanic who'd saved his boss's life was going to become a problem or an asset. Then we owe you more than thanks, Mr. Mitchell. Horizon will make sure you're compensated appropriately for your James cut him off because the implication that saving someone's life deserved monetary compensation felt wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate, but which had something to do with the idea that human decency shouldn't have a price tag attached. I didn't do it for compensation. I did it because it was the right thing to do. The words came out sharper than he'd intended, and Sophie shot him a look that suggested he was being unnecessarily prickly with people who were just trying to help. But James had spent 5 years being patronized by people who assumed poverty equaled stupidity, and he was sensitive to anything that smelled like condescension, even when condescension might not have been intended. Catherine's voice cut through the tension before it could escalate into something unpleasant. What James means is that gratitude and compensation are separate things, and while he's too proud to accept the latter, he can't refuse the former. Which brings me to something I've been thinking about since I woke up. She struggled to sit up despite Daniel's protests and despite the obvious pain the movement caused. And when she spoke, her voice carried determination that made James understand how someone becomes CEO of a $30 billion company. Horizon Technologies is unveiling the Phoenix system next Friday in Portland. It's not just another product launch, it's the culmination of 5 years of work to give people with disabilities the ability to control their environment through neural interfaces. I'd like both of you to be there, James and Sophie, to see what we're building and to understand why that tablet I mentioned matters so much. James started to refuse automatically because Portland was 200 miles away, and he had shifts at the garage and the diner that he couldn't afford to miss. And Sophie had school, and they didn't belong in the world of $30 billion companies and technology demonstrations. But before he could vocalize any of those objections, Sophie grabbed his arm with urgency that suggested she was about to die if they didn't go. Dad, please, this is Horizon Technologies. They're doing work with neural interfaces and brain-computer connections, and it's literally everything I've been studying. Please, can we go? The plea was impossible to resist because Sophie's voice carried hope that James hadn't heard since before Lauren died. Hope that maybe there was something in the world beyond poverty and struggling and 2 jobs that barely covered expenses. He looked at his daughter's face and saw his late wife's eyes staring back at him and remembered Lauren's last words about making sure Sophie had every opportunity to reach as high as her brilliant mind could take her. He looked at Catherine, who was watching this exchange with expression that suggested she understood exactly what internal calculation James was performing and knew which way it needed to come out. All right, we'll come. The words felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory, but Sophie's squeal of joy and the way she threw her arms around his waist made the vertigo worth it, even if he had no idea what he was getting himself and his daughter into. The week between Catherine's rescue and the Friday demonstration passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal to James, like he'd accidentally stepped through a door into someone else's life and was now just trying to keep up with the pace of a world that operated according to rules he didn't understand. Catherine had been transported to Portland for medical treatment. Her broken arm required surgery, and her concussion needed monitoring. But she'd called twice to confirm that James and Sophie were still planning to attend the demonstration and to arrange for Daniel to handle all the logistics. The logistics turned out to involve a hotel reservation at a place that cost more per night than James paid in monthly rent round-trip transportation in one of Horizon's vehicles, because Catherine had apparently decided that James's dying truck wasn't suitable for the 200-mile journey, and an advance payment of $2,000 that Daniel had insisted was to cover any lost wages from missing work rather than compensation for the rescue, because James had been clear about not wanting compensation. James had tried to refuse the money until Sophie pointed out with 12-year-old logic that refusing help because of pride was stupid when they needed the help and when accepting it didn't actually cost him anything except his ego. So he'd accepted and paid the propane bill and fixed the truck's radiator properly instead of with sealant, and bought groceries that included fresh vegetables instead of just rice and beans, and told himself that accepting help once didn't mean he was becoming the kind of person who expected handouts. Thursday evening found them driving toward Portland in a vehicle that was so far beyond James's normal experience that he kept expecting someone to realize there'd been a mistake and demand they return it. Sophie sat in the passenger seat with her nose pressed against the window, watching Oregon landscape roll past while asking questions about neural interfaces and brain-computer connections that James couldn't answer because his engineering degree hadn't covered biomedical applications, and because the world of technology had moved forward considerably in the 15 years since he'd graduated. The hotel was downtown Portland in a building made entirely of glass that reflected the city lights in ways that made it look like something from a science fiction movie. The lobby had a waterfall and furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on, and staff who smiled at James and Sophie like they belonged there, even though James was wearing his best jeans and a shirt that only had one small stain, and Sophie was wearing a dress that Mrs. Martinez had helped her pick out from the thrift store. Their room was on the 20th floor with windows that overlooked the river and a bathroom that was larger than Sophie's bedroom back home. James stood at the window after Sophie had fallen asleep and thought about how strange it was that 3 weeks ago he'd been worried about affording granola bars, and now he was standing in a hotel room that cost more than he made in a month, and how none of this changed anything fundamental about his life. Because on Monday he'd go back to Hank's garage and Rose's diner, in the apartment where the heat barely worked, and the future still looked exactly as difficult as it had looked before he'd pulled Catherine Sterling from a burning plane. Friday morning arrived with nervousness that James tried to hide from Sophie, but which she probably detected anyway because 12-year-olds were perceptive about their parents' emotional states, especially when those parents were terrible at hiding anxiety. They ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant, where the coffee was better than anything Rosa served and where Sophie ordered pancakes without checking the menu prices first, because for once the prices didn't matter. Daniel arrived at 9 to escort them to Horizon Technologies headquarters, and the drive through Portland took them past buildings and businesses that represented a world James had left behind when necessity had forced him to choose between career and survival. The Horizon building was exactly what you'd expect from a $30 billion company, glass and steel rising 40 stories lobby that looked like a modern art museum, security that required badges and escorts and probably background checks that James was grateful he didn't know about because his credit score alone would have triggered alarms. Catherine met them in the lobby, looking professional in a suit despite the cast on her right arm and the fading bruises on her face that makeup couldn't completely hide. Her smile when she saw them carried genuine warmth rather than the corporate politeness James had been expecting. "I'm glad you came. Sophie's going to love what we're working on. And James, I think you might be surprised by how much your perspective matters, even in a field you think you don't understand." The words were kind, but James heard the subtext that said Catherine had looked into his background and knew about the engineering degree he'd never used professionally and was trying to make him feel like he belonged here, even though they both knew he didn't. Still, it was a thoughtful gesture, and James appreciated it even as he reminded himself not to get comfortable in a world he'd be leaving as soon as the demonstration ended. The tour of Horizon's facilities took 2 hours and covered enough ground that James's back was protesting by the end, despite the pain medication he'd taken that morning. They saw laboratories where engineers worked on prototypes that looked like they belonged in science fiction, conference rooms where billion-dollar decisions were made, and finally the innovation lab where the Phoenix system waited under careful security. The system itself was elegant in a way that made James's engineering training appreciate the design even before he understood the function. Neural sensors so small, they looked like jewelry processing units that fitted in your pocket interfaces that required nothing more than thought and minimal movement to control computers and robotic arms and environmental systems. For people whose bodies had stopped responding to their mind's commands, Phoenix meant independence and dignity and the possibility of lives that weren't defined entirely by disability. Sophie was asking questions that demonstrated she'd been reading technical papers that were probably above her grade level anyway, and the engineers were responding with the enthusiasm of people who loved their work and appreciated when someone else understood what they were trying to accomplish. James hung back and watched his daughter bloom in this environment where intelligence was valued and where questions were encouraged, and something in his chest ached with recognition that this was where she belonged and where he had no idea how to get her. One of the senior engineers, a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Reeves, was explaining the technical challenges of maintaining signal fidelity when James noticed something that his mechanical background flagged as potential problem. The mounting system that held the neural sensors in position used a hinge design that looked elegant, but which would probably fail under repeated stress because the angle was wrong for the forces it needed to handle. He hesitated before speaking because pointing out design flaws in a $30 billion company's flagship product when you were a mechanic from Hearthlight seemed presumptuous at best and insulting at worst. But his Army training had been clear about the importance of identifying problems before they became catastrophic failures, and his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent about something that could potentially hurt the people who'd eventually use this system. Excuse me. His voice was quiet enough that he could pretend he hadn't spoken if everyone ignored him, but Dr. Reeves turned with expression that suggested she was willing to listen. I think there might be an issue with the hinge assembly on the sensor mount. The angle is putting shear stress on the connection point instead of distributing the load along the bearing surface. Under repeated use, especially with any kind of impact or vibration, you're probably going to see metal fatigue that leads to catastrophic failure. The room went silent in a way that made James regret opening his mouth, but then Dr. Reeves pulled up the CAD specifications on a nearby screen and spent 30 seconds reviewing the geometry before her eyes widened with recognition. He's right, the force vector analysis shows stress concentration at exactly the point he identified. Under normal use conditions, we're looking at failure after maybe 10,000 cycles, which sounds like a lot until you realize users would hit that in less than 6 months. She turned to James with expression that combined surprise with respect that felt unearned. How did you spot that? Even our structural engineers missed it during design review. James shrugged uncomfortably because explaining that you developed an intuition for mechanical failure after spending years fixing broken transmissions and i.e. damaged vehicles seemed like it would sound either boastful or pathetic depending on how you framed it. I've spent a lot of time working with systems that break under stress. After a while, you start recognizing the patterns that lead to failure. Catherine had been watching this exchange from across the room, and now she approached with expression that made James nervous because he couldn't read what she was thinking. That insight just saved us from a recall that would have cost millions and destroyed our credibility. The words were delivered calmly but with weight that suggested she understood exactly how significant the problem would have been. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from people who've spent their lives making broken things work again. The rest of the morning passed with James feeling simultaneously more comfortable and less comfortable, more comfortable because the engineers were treating him like someone whose opinion mattered less. Comfortable because he kept expecting someone to realize this was a mistake and ask him to leave before he broke something expensive. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement as they moved through the facility, and watching her interact with people who took her seriously and encouraged her questions made every awkward moment worth enduring. Lunch was in Horizon's executive dining room, with views that stretched across Portland to the mountains beyond, and James found himself sitting next to Catherine while Sophie was absorbed in conversation with Dr. Reeves about neuroplasticity and signal processing algorithms. The food was better than anything James had eaten in years, and he felt guilty about enjoying it when Mrs. Martinez was probably eating tuna fish sandwiches back in Hearthlight, but Catherine seemed determined to make him comfortable, even though comfort wasn't something he knew how to accept from billionaires. "You're wondering why I invited you here." She said it as statement rather than question, and James didn't bother denying it because his confusion was probably obvious. "I thought it was because you wanted to thank me for the rescue. That's part of it. But mostly it's because Sophie deserves to see what's possible, and you deserve to see that your engineering knowledge still has value, even if circumstances haven't let you use it the way you plan." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I meant what I said about perspective. The people in this building are brilliant, but sometimes brilliance creates blind spots. We need people who understand how things fail in the real world, not just how they work in simulations." James wanted to argue that one good catch during a facility tour didn't make him qualified to work in aerospace technology, but before he could formulate the objection, Catherine's phone buzzed with urgency that made her expression shift from friendly to professional in an instant. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale in a way that suggested the message contained bad news. "I need to take this. Daniel will show you to the auditorium where the demonstration starts in an hour." She disappeared toward her office while Daniel materialized to guide James and Sophie through more corridors of glass and steel. The auditorium, when they reached it, was already filling with people who looked important suits, that whispered money tablets, that showed stock portfolios, conversations that referenced billion-dollar deals with the casual ease of people for whom billions were just numbers on spreadsheets. James and Sophie were shown to seats near the front, where they had clear view of the stage and the equipment that would be used for the demonstration. The presentation began with Catherine at the podium, despite the cast on her arm, her voice carrying across the auditorium with practiced confidence as she explained Phoenix Systems' capabilities and the clinical trials that had shown remarkable results. She spoke about independence and dignity and the human cost of disability in ways that made it clear this was personal for her, beyond just business success, though she didn't explain why, and James didn't have enough context to guess. The demonstration was scheduled to show Phoenix's ability to let users control external devices through nothing but thought and minimal movement, and Catherine explained that they'd invited a young volunteer to participate because showing real-world applications with real people was more meaningful than laboratory simulations. When she announced that the volunteer was Sophie, James felt his stomach drop because this hadn't been part of the plan, and because putting his daughter on stage in front of hundreds of investors and journalists felt like risking something he wasn't prepared to risk. Sophie turned to him with eyes that were excited rather than scared, and James found himself nodding permission, even though everything in his protective instincts was screaming about danger and unknown risks and all the ways this could go wrong. She walked onto the stage with confidence that made him proud and terrified in equal measure, and engineers fitted her with the neural sensors that looked delicate against her dark hair. The system initialized with graphics on a large screen showing Sophie's neural patterns being translated into commands, and when she thought about moving her hand, the robotic arm on stage responded by lifting in perfect synchronization. The crowd applauded, and Sophie smiled with pure joy that made James's chest ache, because this was his daughter doing something extraordinary and being recognized for her intelligence instead of being dismissed because of her poverty. Then the system glitched. Lights on the control panel flickered red, and the robotic arm jerked violently in ways that weren't responding to Sophie's commands. Her face showed confusion, shifting rapidly to fear as the feedback through the neural sensors caused visible discomfort. James was already moving before his conscious mind registered the decision, shoving through the crowd of stunned spectators, focused entirely on reaching his daughter before the malfunctioning system could hurt her. "Shut it down." His voice carried military authority that made people respond automatically, but the engineers were already frantically typing commands that the system was refusing to accept. The robotic arm swung toward Sophie's head with force that could have caused serious injury, and James launched himself onto the stage, ripping the neural sensors from his daughter's temples, with complete disregard for whether he was damaging expensive equipment or violating protocols. Sparks erupted from the interface as connections tore free, and the robotic arm froze mid-swing before going completely dead. Sophie collapsed forward, and James caught her feeling her body shake with shock and fear as she buried her face against his chest. The auditorium erupted into chaos, journalists shouting questions, investors demanding explanations, security trying to restore order. But James ignored all of it because the only thing that mattered was that Sophie was breathing and conscious and apparently uninjured beyond being scared. Catherine was barking orders with the kind of controlled urgency that came from someone who knew crisis management was about staying calm while everyone else panicked. Within minutes, Daniel and the IT security team had isolated the cause. The system hadn't malfunctioned randomly, but had been actively hacked by someone with sophisticated understanding of Horizon's security protocols and Phoenix's control architecture. James carried Sophie off the stage while medical personnel checked her for injuries that thankfully didn't exist beyond elevated heart rate and stress response. Catherine appeared beside them with expression that combined professional concern and personal guilt in a way that made James realize she blamed herself for inviting Sophie to participate. "I'm so sorry." Her voice was tight with emotion she was barely controlling. The system was supposed to be completely secure. Someone deliberately sabotaged it, and I will find out who, and they will pay for putting your daughter at risk. James wanted to be angry, wanted to blame Catherine for exposing Sophie to danger, but the truth was that Sophie had wanted to participate, and James had agreed, and sometimes bad things happen that weren't anyone's fault except the person who'd actively caused them. Instead of anger, he felt exhaustion that came from adrenaline crash, combined with the recognition that he and Sophie didn't belong in this world where corporate sabotage and billion-dollar stakes made children into acceptable collateral damage. We should go. His words were flat and tired. This was a mistake. We don't belong here. Catherine looked like she wanted to argue, but before she could respond, Sophie lifted her head from James's shoulder with expression that suggested she was processing everything that had happened and reaching conclusions that her father wasn't going to like. No, Dad. This isn't a mistake. Someone tried to hurt people by breaking something important, and that means we need to stay and help fix it, not run away because things got scary. The words hit James with force because they echoed exactly the kind of logic Lauren would have used, and because his 12-year-old daughter was apparently braver than he was. He looked at Catherine and saw hope mixed with determination that suggested she would keep fighting regardless of whether James and Sophie stayed or left, but that she wanted them to stay because their presence mattered in ways James didn't fully understand. Before he could respond, Daniel appeared with a tablet showing preliminary forensic analysis of the hack. The digital signature matched coding patterns from programmers known to work for Kane Industries, a competing company that had been trying to acquire or replicate Horizon's neural interface technology for the past 3 years. The CEO of Kane Industries was Victor Kane, 61, known for aggressive business practices that occasionally crossed legal boundaries and currently desperate because his own company's stock was falling while Horizon's was rising. But there was more in the file that Daniel pulled up information about Victor's personal life that added context to the sabotage. His daughter Emily Kane was 16 and suffering from ALS Lou Gehrig's disease, which had already progressed to the point where she needed ventilator support and had lost the ability to move or speak. Phoenix System was exactly the kind of technology that could have helped Emily communicate and control her environment, but Catherine had refused to rush clinical trials despite Victor's repeated requests to make exceptions for compassionate use cases. James read the file and felt his anger at the saboteur shift into something more complicated because he understood what it meant to watch someone you love suffer and to feel powerless to help them. Victor Kane had made terrible choices driven by desperation and love, which didn't excuse those choices, but did explain them in ways that simple villainy couldn't. The rest of Friday passed in emergency meetings where Catherine worked with FBI agents who'd arrived to investigate the sabotage, and with her board of directors who wanted to shut down Phoenix development until security could be guaranteed, and with journalists who wanted statements about whether the technology was fundamentally dangerous. Through it all, she maintained composure that impressed James even as he recognized it was costing her enormous effort to keep functioning under this level of stress. By evening, it was clear that Catherine needed rest more than she needed to keep working, but she kept pushing through meetings and calls and crisis management until her body made the decision for her. James was in the lobby waiting to find out whether Daniel could arrange transportation back to Hearthlight when he heard shouting from the executive floor, followed by sounds of people running. He reached the conference room to find Catherine collapsed on the floor, with Daniel and Dr. Reeves kneeling beside her. Her right hand was trembling violently, and her eyes were unfocused in a way that suggested she wasn't fully conscious. James pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, and his Army medic training took over, automatically checking airway and breathing and pulse, while asking questions about medications and known conditions. Dr. Reeves answered with obvious reluctance that suggested she was revealing information she wasn't authorized to reveal. She has Parkinson's disease. Early onset, diagnosed 3 years ago. The stress of today, combined with missed medications, triggered a dyskinetic episode. The words made pieces click into place for James, the tremor he'd noticed in Catherine's hand during their first meeting, the way she'd sometimes pause before reaching for objects, the intense focus on Phoenix system development that suddenly made sense if she was building technology that might help manage her own progressive disability. He helped get her onto a couch while Dr. Reeves administered medication that would take 20 minutes to be fully effective, and he stayed beside her until the tremors began subsiding and consciousness began returning. When Catherine's eyes finally focused on him, they showed embarrassment that made James understand she'd worked hard to keep this condition hidden, and that having it exposed publicly was humiliating in ways that nearly dying in a plane crash somehow wasn't. Now you know. Her voice was weak but carried resignation. The brilliant CEO is just another patient who's going to end up needing the same technology she's building to help everyone else. James had spent 5 years learning how to talk to Sophie about difficult topics, and some of that experience translated into knowing what to say now. The brilliant CEO is someone who's fighting a disease by helping millions of other people fight theirs. That's not weakness. That's courage most people will never have to demonstrate. Something in Catherine's expression shifted, and James thought he saw tears forming before she blinked them away and returned to the controlled competence that was apparently how she survived in a world that would destroy her if she showed vulnerability. The drive back to Hearthlight happened late Friday night after Catherine was stable enough that doctors cleared her to rest at home with monitoring rather than requiring hospitalization. James and Sophie rode in the back of one of Horizon's vehicles while Daniel drove, and while Portland's lights gave way to darkness and highway, and eventually the familiar landscape of eastern Oregon. Sophie fell asleep against James's shoulder, and he sat watching shadows and thinking about everything that had happened in the past week and how none of it fit into any narrative that made sense. Saturday morning found them back in the apartment where heat barely worked and bills needed paying, and normal life resumed its familiar patterns. Mrs. Martinez appeared with breakfast she'd accidentally made too much of, and with questions about Portland that Sophie answered with enthusiasm while James tried to process the fact that he'd gone from mechanic to someone that Catherine Sterling apparently wanted to consult about engineering problems. The phone call came Sunday evening while James was fixing the apartment's leaking faucet with parts he'd bought from the hardware store using money he probably should have saved for something more important. Catherine's voice on the line carried careful formality that suggested she'd thought about this conversation extensively before making the call. I know you said you didn't want compensation, but I'm not offering compensation. I'm offering a position. Director of Practical Applications for Phoenix System, reporting to Dr. Reeves, with a salary that's competitive for someone with your experience in education. Your job would be translating engineering theory into real-world solutions and identifying problems before they become catastrophic failures, like the hinge issue you caught. James's first instinct was to refuse because accepting felt like charity, and because he had no business working at a $30 billion company when his employment history for the past 5 years consisted of fixing transmissions and serving coffee. But before he could verbalize the refusal, Catherine continued in a voice that suggested she'd anticipated his objections. Sophie's been accepted into Horizon's Young Innovators program. Full scholarship mentorship from our senior engineers, summer internship opportunities. She's brilliant, and she deserves teachers who can challenge her instead of holding her back. So the question isn't whether you're qualified. You proved that when you spotted the design flaw that would have cost us millions. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept help building a better future for your daughter. The words hit like physical blows because they were precisely calibrated to target every vulnerability James had been protecting for 5 years. He looked at Sophie, who was pretending to read, but who was obviously listening to every word of this conversation, and he saw Lauren's eyes staring back at him and remembered her last words about making sure their daughter had every opportunity to fly as high as her brilliant mind could take her. His throat was too tight to speak immediately, but he managed to force out words that felt like surrender and liberation simultaneously. When do I start? 1 year later, on a Saturday morning in November, when the anniversary of Catherine's crash had come around again with the strange circularity that marked time's passage. James stood in the same field where he'd pulled a stranger from burning wreckage and watched that stranger's life become entangled with his own in ways neither of them could have predicted. The field had been cleared and prepared for planting, and Sophie stood beside him, holding a young oak sapling that they'd selected together from a nursery that specialized in native Oregon species. Catherine approached from where her car was parked at the field's edge, moving carefully because the Parkinson's had progressed enough that balance was becoming unreliable despite medication, and despite the prototype Phoenix interface she sometimes wore to help manage tremors. The past year had transformed all their lives in ways both obvious and subtle. James had moved from mechanic to engineer, from poverty to middle-class stability, from struggling to keep food on the table to being able to afford Sophie's field trips without calculating whether the cost meant going without groceries. But more than financial stability, he'd found purpose in work that used his skills to help people, and he'd found something else in Catherine's presence that he'd thought died with Lauren: the possibility of connection with someone who saw him clearly and valued him anyway. Sophie had bloomed in the Young Innovators program, her natural brilliance, finding expression in projects that were already attracting attention from universities that wanted to recruit her when she was old enough for college. But more importantly, she'd found confidence that came from being in an environment where intelligence was celebrated rather than mocked, where questions were encouraged rather than dismissed, where her dreams of designing aircraft weren't treated as fantasies, but as achievable goals that required hard work and persistence. And Catherine had found something she'd been searching for without knowing she was searching: a family built not by biology, but by choice, by shared crisis, by the recognition that sometimes the people who saved you weren't the ones you expected. Her Parkinson's was progressing, but Phoenix System was helping manage symptoms and providing independence that medication alone couldn't offer, and more importantly, she'd stopped fighting the disease in isolation and had learned to accept help from people who cared about her. They worked together in comfortable silence, digging the hole deep enough for the oak's roots, lowering the sapling carefully into place, filling the space around it with soil that James packed down with his hands. Sophie patted the last of the dirt into place and stepped back to admire their work, with satisfaction that suggested she understood the symbolism, even if nobody had explained it explicitly. It'll grow strong. Her voice carried certainty beyond her 13 years. Every year will come back, and it'll be bigger, and we'll remember how everything changed that night, and how sometimes the worst things lead to the best things. Catherine slipped her hand into James's, and he felt the slight tremor that medication couldn't completely suppress, and squeezed gently to let her know the tremor didn't matter, that he saw her completely and valued her completely, and that her illness was part of who she was, but not the definition of who she was, a symbol of second chances. Catherine's voice was quiet but steady. Of the night fate decided to rewrite all our stories and give us futures we never imagined. James looked at the oak tree that would grow here for decades or centuries, marking the place where catastrophe had become transformation, where stranger had become family, where the end of one life had created space for another life to begin. He thought about Lauren and the promise he'd made to let Sophie fly, and he realized with clarity that felt like revelation that keeping that promise hadn't meant doing it alone, or refusing help, or measuring success by how much he could endure without breaking. Keeping the promise meant building a life where Sophie's brilliance could flourish, where opportunities were abundant rather than scarce, where futures were expansive rather than limited. And if that life included Catherine, who saw value in a mechanic's insights, and who challenged James to believe he was more than his circumstances, then maybe that was part of the promise too. Not replacing Lauren, but honoring her memory by refusing to let grief prevent the living from continuing to build lives worth living. The wind moved through the field with the particular quality of Oregon autumn, carrying the smell of rain and earth, and the promise of seasons that would continue turning regardless of human drama. James stood with his daughter on one side and Catherine on the other, three figures under a vast sky, and felt something that might have been peace settling over him, like recognition that he'd finally arrived somewhere worth reaching after years of wandering through landscape that had felt hostile to survival. Fortune favors the bold, Catherine's grandfather used to say. But sometimes fortune favored the ones who stopped to help strangers who ran toward fire instead of away from it, who believed that saving one person could change the world in ways that rippled outward far beyond the initial act of rescue. The oak tree stood quiet between earth and sky, roots reaching down into soil, while branches reached up toward light, growing in the only direction that mattered. Forward, always forward toward futures that none of them could predict, but all of them were brave enough to face together.